In my previous video, I talked about the distinction between a fixture and a trend, specifically with respects to what is currently perceived to be a different mating market. And this time around, I want to talk about something related and what I regard as also being a type of false perception given the current circumstances we find ourselves in. And that is this idea that the tide is changing with respects to, say, SJW culture, far leftism, etc., etc. And it makes sense that people would be led to believe that the winds are changing, that things are in flux. But in order to understand this, we have to understand the basis of culture and how all this stuff emerged in the first place. Now, in the previous decade, we all had borne witness to the emergence of certain trends. The primary trend to be discussed here is the trend of so-called SJWism, far leftism, the many points of absurdity and insanity that have been brought to the table, and by and large how they've ruined certain cultural aspects of our society, whether it's comic books, gaming, etc., etc. And perhaps more relevantly, in terms of actual policy, things like university government and what have you. Now, this is definitely a trend. SJW culture has been a trend, and if you look around at the current world and its current landscape, then yes, one quickly gets the impression that SJWism is in recession, that it's in decline. And some people have been saying that even before the current set of circumstances. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be as apparent. And the obvious logic here is that when the going gets tough, the not so tough get going, as in they tend to disappear off the grid. But this speaks to an essential point about civilization and culture itself, which is to say, culture does not exist in a vacuum. I've been hammering this point home for years. Culture is a byproduct of the confluence of biology and environment. And people correctly point out, I think, that modern SJWism and the sorts of things that we can witness, this is largely a derivative, an extension of the perception of rights and quote-unquote liberties that were pursued in, say, the 60s. Civil rights, equality under the law, etc., etc., just then it's been extended to an insane degree. Now, the problem here is that people are missing the forest for the trees. It's not, as I said, that SJWism or this type of thinking emerged in a vacuum. No, it emerged in a very specific type of culture and environment, namely, a very safe and secure culture environment. If it indeed is the case that we can say that SJWism is in recession, far leftism is in recession, then only because at the moment there is very much an extenuating circumstance, a circumstance that takes precedence over some of these more petty concerns that they might offer and bring to the table. Now, on the point of trends, it's very easy to say that it has been a trend, and the fact that it's not been a fixture is indicated by its relative decline right now at the moment. But trends can resurface. And what many people don't get about the type of cultural things we see these days is that they're largely a matter of the march of time and the march of so-called progress, which is to say, in really safe environments, such as the many things that occurred in the 20th century in terms of political rights and what have you, activism, it's only natural that people feeling secure and safe will gravitate to the next level. And if people want to retain, by way of contrast, a society that doesn't have this type of culture or subculture, then the society it exists in has to be under a type of threat. And this threat can be real or perceived. It can be biotic, it can be political, it can be any number of things, or it can be a combination of these things. But after all these years, for example, in Europe, of saying you couldn't lock down borders and globalization and immigration, we now have a situation where effectively the EU is dead in terms of its application, which is to say you cannot travel freely within the Schengen zone, as has been the case for a very long time, because there's a serious threat. At least there's the perception of that. And I do think it's very serious, mind you. But the perception is more important than the actuality. And so The borders went on lockdown. And the problem I see going forward, if people are really looking at this as more than just a temporary change in trend that can bounce back to its prior state, is that without the perception of threat and constant worry, society tends to drift, at least in the West, in that direction. And I'd argue in certain places in the East as well, as much as it's a global phenomenon. So without threat perception, I think it's very likely we're going to see a resurgence of this type of stuff. Maybe not immediately, and maybe not even a year or two, but sometime in the future, almost certainly in the not too distant future. Because that's just human nature. If you remove the dangers, people are going to be on the lookout for new dangers. They're going to want more and more and more. It's never enough. You can't say to these types of people, it's good enough, or X is good enough. We've gotten this far, it's okay. We don't need to push for more, because that doesn't sync with large swaths of humanity and the way they think. So if I were to say that there's a takeaway from all of this, it probably would be found in the fact that inasmuch as these measures are temporary, for however long they might be in place, we will see some decline and recession in far leftism or SJWism or whatever you want to term it. We will likewise see a return, a resurgence of all these things. So yes, at the moment, you're not hearing much caterwauling or arguments for quadrisexual furry rights or whatever it is they like to talk about. But if we bounce back to a state of relative security, people being mollified as they are, will start talking about this stuff again. And this is the fundamental problem, the fundamental conflict of virtually all civilization, especially for conservative people, right? Conservative people like to preserve the past. They're more concerned about borders and traditions and exclusion and things like that on average. But the only way you can have that type of society is to be in a perpetual state of threat and danger. I always like to bring Ireland up after it gained its independence in the 1920s because they were very, very vigilant, strongly religious, Catholic, etc., but decades onwards, a lot of that vigilance, a lot of that wakefulness, so to speak, has receded, if not all of it. And then if you look at a country such as Israel, which for better or worse has put itself in a state of perpetual threat, they're much more draconian about everything than compared to other Western countries. And so if you have a threat narrative, whether it's real or perceived, that is how you can maintain the kinds of fixtures, if you want to call them that a lot of more right-leaning people would prefer. I don't have a horse in the race of the left versus the right. I'm just an observer here. So I'm not really sure if there's a good solution here. The alternative, there are alternatives. You can have something like the CCP in you-know-where that is effectively a dictatorship, or perhaps even worse, arguably, North Korea, which is a highly orchestrated dictatorial society. Okay. But then the question arises, do you want to live in that type of society? I have to say for my own part, I probably don't, but to each his own. So there are always gains and losses. But if one were to be hopeful, and I were to be hopeful, I would say perhaps, just perhaps, people will take home certain lessons from the current set of circumstances and then apply them to the future. Those lessons being, perhaps we should pay attention to more important things than the quintessential pony-emulating furry whose rights are being trampled upon. But that's just what I think. I think ultimately we're probably going to drift back in that direction, and the trajectory we were on was one that was backed up by decades of political and cultural momentum. So we'll see what happens. But again, to make this distinction between fixture and trend, I think it's very much a trend now, just as the SJW stuff was a trend. But it's a trend that, assuming no disaster takes place, assuming no threat or threat narrative is strong enough to enter into civilization or society, it's a trend that in time might actually become a fixture. And barring creating a society like North Korea or CCP land, it might be very, very difficult to get rid of it, apart from raising civilization itself to the ground, in which case you wouldn't be listening to me because there would be no internet, and I wouldn't be making this because there would be no internet, and we'd all lose a large number of things, to say the least. In any event, gentlemen, I hope you're keeping healthy and safe in this current situation, and if I'm still alive and sufficiently hale, I will check you out later. As always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.